Bridget was just removing the gloves. Before I could begin apologizing, she came over and put her arms around me and rested her head on my shoulder. I wrapped her in a hug, and everything else stopped mattering. 21. The Return. Bill, June 22-23, 82 Eridani. I was visiting Mac at 82 Eridani. I tried to stay on top of things at the different sites, and to be honest, I needed a break. The others had just finished harvesting the PAV homeworld, and several years of observing their technique hadn't blunted the emotional turmoil. I sat in one of Mac's lawn chairs, blowing on a coffee to cool it down. Turned out Mac liked the ritual involved in cooling the coffee until it was drinkable. I could have just adjusted it, but that would be rude. Mac took a sip of his own coffee, then continued his report. Things are looking good. The Canadian colony on Asgard is doing well. Much better now, actually, since the vampire mosquitoes are being brought under control. Super vampire power mosquitoes, I corrected. Mutant super vampire power mosquitoes, he quipped. Honestly, Bill, original Bob would have run screaming from the place. You remember how our skin reacted to even itty-bitty mosquito bites? Yep. Fine Nordic skin. I grinned at him. Why do you think I haven't asked for pictures? Mac nodded, still grinning. Anyway, the mosquito killers are one of the more popular pieces of automation in New Vancouver. I just have to say mosquito killers and I can get anything approved on the printer schedule. And speaking of inconveniences, how is the Japanese colony doing with their unique problem? Mac laughed. You are. The very stinky elephant? He waggled his eyebrows. Or maybe it's just what the elephant left behind? Yeah, that one, I said, chuckling. Seriously, they can't get used to it? It's seasonal, Bill, and affected by wind and weather. It turns out to be a common plant in the ubiquitous.
Ебать его!
liquid as swamps. Sort of a local version of skunk cabbage, but much more potent. And what are they going to do about it? Nuking has been suggested, Max said deadpan. Seriously? I don't think they were serious, Bill, but it was brought up. I checked it out with the android once to see for myself, figuratively speaking. Let me tell you, it's bad. I disabled olfactory input after that. So, on a more realistic note, what can they do? He shrugged. Draining the swamps, developing something to kill off the plants, breed a less smelly version of the plants that will outcompete the wild version. Don't get involved. Just don't. Works for me, Mac grinned back. Anyway, I'm too busy with the space-based industry. Vern collected a lot of raw materials into the Lagrange points, but between colonies and all the equipment on Valhalla for the terraforming, he shrugged. Yeah, I'm going through it pretty fast. I've got drones and roamers flying around the system looking for more. Right in the middle of Mac's center. I found myself back in my own VR. Guppy, what happened?
Interface with other vessel was terminated abruptly. No shutdown handshake.
What the hell? I attempted to ping Mac, but got nothing. Guppy, try every option you have. Try to get any comms going at all with Mac or anything in the area. I waited for several intolerable milliseconds. What could have taken Mac out like that? Or was it just a communications issue of some kind?
Scutlink relay has been acquired to several onboard rovers. Vessel is heavily damaged. Replicant is offline.
What? Give me a connection to one of them. Guppy handed me a connection and I entered the roamer. I stared, shocked, at a view of empty space through a huge rent in the side of Mac's vessel. Shards of metal and pieces of equipment floated around and caromed off of walls and other flotsam. What the hell caused this? I thought immediately of the others. Could they have sent an expedition here to learn more about us? No, that didn't make sense. They didn't know about this system. Then, movement. An outline shifted against the starry backdrop. I ran image analysis against several frames from the roamer's video and was able to extract a silhouette. Medeiros. The bastard must have coasted up to Mac's location and hit him with a missile from short range. No time to deal with the rage, though. I left the roamer for a moment, jacked myself up to maximum frame rate, and pondered the situation. 2 milliseconds later, I returned to normal time and sent an all Bob's text at high priority. Medeiros in 82 Eridani. Mac taken out. Need Bob's to locate and connect with all available AMIs. Coordinate with my Guppy. Guppy, inspect an inventory. Get me a report on the state of Mac's vessel.
Aye.
Without waiting for a response, I returned to my roamer. Medeiros' exact plans were unknown, but there were several possibilities, all of which had to be blocked. Several texts came in from other Bobs who had connected with other roamers on board or out by the auto factories. I began giving orders. Bobs on board, protect replicant matrix, sequester or destroy of self-destruct. If anyone can get a roamer onto Medeiros' ship, do so. We need him tagged. Bobs at auto factories. Gather and inventory printers. We have to be prepared to keep them in his hands. Any other Bobs? Check in. I returned my attention to the Brazilian craft, which was edging up to Mac's ship. At that moment, Medeiros performed a SUDAR scan on us. I froze, as did every roamer on board. No sense showing him what was still active. The scan lasted less than a second, and the Brazilian kept edging in. The safest thing would have been for him to blow us up. Either he was hoarding his missiles, or he wanted the Heaven vessel as intact as possible. A text from Thor came in. Mac's cube is intact. The image that Thor had sent with the text left no doubt. Mac's cube had escaped the zone of destruction. That was both good and bad. Good because we hadn't permanently lost a Bob. Bad because it was one of the items that Medeiros might be going for. A cube could be put up on a cradle and either infected with something, as Homer had been, or even tortured. Thor, get the cube out of here. Just jump. If it looks like you'll be captured, destroy it. Thor responded immediately. 10-4. Who's got eyes on the reactor? I asked. Oliver responded. It's toast. No possibility of a self-destruct. Damn. That meant this would have to be done the hard way. It also meant we were running on power cells. At some point, the Scut transceiver would give out, and that would be it for our access to 82 Aridity. I didn't have time to ponder the alternatives. Okay, guys, disassemble all tech, start flinging pieces. Nothing survives. Oliver, can you gather the Scut and a few power cells? Will do. Movement from the Brazilian attracted my attention. The cargo doors opened and a number of roamers jumped in the direction of Mac's ship. I sent a general alert. Prepare to repel boarders. In moments, a half-dozen roamers joined me at the rent in Mac's hull. There were twice as many of them, so I had no real illusions about winning the battle. Our roamers had no particular advantage in this situation. The best we could do was to hold them off until the sabotage crew could get it done. The enemy roamers came straight in, no finesse, no feints, and why shouldn't they? Straight numerical advantage was a strategy all its own. The battle lasted almost 2 minutes. Roamers are very tough devices. They're specifically designed to be able to operate with up to half their legs missing. The plasma cutters were the weapon of choice on both sides. The battle resembled, no kidding, one of those old Errol Flynn sword fight melee scenes, as long as you imagined giant spiders instead of actors in tights. Roamers parried and riposted all over the cargo bay, the occasional errant leg floating through the mix. Finally, though, they took us out. The last roamer, crewed by Jacques, put up a great fight, wedged into the axial corridor so that no one could get by. But an attack from two opponents at once took out his cutter limb, and that was it. In moments, he was scrap. How did we do? I grouped text. It was far too volatile for any kind of VR meetup, and in fact I imagined everyone had given up VR for the duration. Mac is well out of here, 2 roamers in attendance, Thor responded. We'll slice and dice if necessary. All remaining onboard SUDAR and Scut tech is toothpicks, someone else added. Except for the transceiver, Oliver said, and I'll destroy that if it looks like it'll be taken. I thought for a moment. Okay, guys, let's do as much damage to this asshole as possible. Let him have the Hulk. Instead, let's go for his vessel. There were acknowledgments, and I watched from a piggyback feed as the 5 surviving roamers, still on board, leaped across space toward the Brazilian. Unfortunately, Medeiros was ready for us. A half-dozen roamers leaped out of his hold to intercept. Another cutter fight ensued, this one in free fall between the ships. Roamers had small compressed air nozzles for free-fall maneuvering, but those wouldn't last long. Our roamers attempted to get feet on metal as quickly as possible, with the opponents attempting to block us or toss us off. Less than a minute later, we found, to our surprise, that we'd won the fight. 2 of our roamers still survived, 1 only barely, but on a last-man-standing basis, it was enough. Medeiros apparently thought so as well, because his ship... I had a pretty good idea what was coming. A few seconds later, my suspicions were confirmed as a missile appeared from the distance. Looks like we're done, guys. The missile arrived, and once again, I was back in my VR. Guppy, what do we have?
Replicant Matrix is on a ballistic trajectory with 2 roamers attending. 4 drones with Scud comms have been located, attending the auto factories. 1 is on the way to retrieve the Matrix. HIC 71683-8 is in control. 8 more groups in the outer system are several days away at full acceleration.
I smiled despite myself at Guppy's response. For some reason, Guppy refused to identify any Bob by name. It was their serial number or nothing. I kept promising myself I'd look into it someday, but I knew I wouldn't. This particular replicant, Isaac, was one of Bart's early clones, senior even to Oliver. He had connected with one of the attendant drones and was racing to pick up Max Matrix, along with the 2 roamers. Okay, everyone, I broadcast. Emergency moot in the pub. Video attendance for those of you currently controlling devices. I popped over to the moot VR and configured the pub. Within moments, a half-dozen video images and a dozen more Bobs had popped in. I looked around doing a quick evaluation from metadata. Thanks for your quick response, guys. So here's what we have. A Brazilian vessel seems to have managed to sneak into 82 Eridani and take out Mac. Unfortunately, he's the only Bob in system, and he didn't have any clones going. Where's he from, do you think? Asked Oliver. I shook my head. I couldn't get a good enough look. I did, Loki interjected. I was in the group fighting out between the ships, and I got a better angle on the vessel. It's the one from Alpha Centauri. Definitely a different series from the Madeiri that we took down in 82 Eridani. Well, that's interesting. I rubbed my chin. Is Calvin or Goku here? I looked around for a moment, but no joy. I guess not. Anyway, I remember that they were pretty sure that the Medeiros they chased out of Alpha Centauri wasn't complete. Didn't have his auto factory tech loaded yet, Oliver added. Right, which makes his strategy pretty obvious. Take out the resident Bob, then take over the auto factories. I thought for a moment. Can we protect the auto factories? Not a chance. Loki shrugged. 3 for now, drones and some miscellaneous roamers and mining equipment. Not much to work with. Mac had everything geared for a developing colony. He wasn't even working on a cohort. Should we just destroy them? Asked Isaac. I'd prefer not to. Otherwise they are dead in the water until another Bob gets there. And who is closest anyway? I looked up and thought. Hank's at P Eridani, a little under 11 light years. Tau Ceti and Vulcan are about 12. And of course Epsilon Eridani at 12.5. At least a decade for any help, no matter how you look at it. That's way too long to have a Brazilian wandering around the system making nasty. Well, what's he going to do? Loki looked around, palms up in an imploring gesture. He can't make more of him. He can't make movers to drop rocks on our colonies. He can't make weapons. I don't want to find out, I replied. Maybe he has a printer in his cargo hold. Maybe he gets hold of one of ours. Maybe he has plenty, and he just wanted to get rid of Mac, and I'm wrong about the other stuff. Well, that's the interesting thing, Isaac said. The missile that finally took out Mac's ship wasn't military grade, not by a long shot. And if the first missile had been military grade, there wouldn't have been anything left in the first place. I think Medeiros has, or had, some kind of factory set up somewhere and made some home brew explosive systems. I nodded and thought, we keep dismissing him as not an engineer, but that's probably facile. Brazil would have uploaded a lot of military knowledge, and improvising explosives is not a huge leap. He could have produced something like Busters, but with a payload at the front end. It wouldn't have to be terrifically efficient. So we can't say how many missiles or whatever that he has on board. Isaac rubbed his chin. Although he'd have to go back to his factory to restock, assuming it's in system. My feeling is that it's not. Calvin and Goku took out Alpha Centauri back in 2163. That's 60 years ago. It's only 19 light years from 82 Eridani, so where's he been all this time? In system? Skulking around? Nope, Loki replied. We took 82 Eridani in 2195. He'd have been here by then. And we did a thorough scan of the system. I sighed and rubbed my forehead. Okay, So it's likely that he stopped at some other system for a couple of decades and built up some manufacturing capability. Probably not a lot, or he'd have proper missiles. He loaded up, then continued to here, which presumably he knew was a target system for Brazil. That still doesn't sound quite right, Bill. I agree, Isaac, but there's only so much we can deduce from what we know, and we're probably over the line into speculation now. I looked around. Who's controlling the roamers that are with Mac? Well, no one now, Oliver replied. As soon as Medeiros blew up Mac's vessel, we lost Scud comms. Any surviving roamers will be operating autonomously on the last orders we gave them. Can we link up to roamers through drones, Scud? Loki asked. Sure, Will responded. We've been doing it for years in Seoul when dealing with things in the outer system. It's too much trouble to set up a separate comm station. I turned to Will and grinned. Glad to have you here. How much of this did you catch? He hadn't been here when we started, so I knew he was late to the party. Will nodded to me. I jacked and played back the session recording. I'm up to date. Turning to Loki, he said, It's just a small software patch. I'll post it for you. Loki nodded. So we have 4 drones, which means we have 4 loci of control in the system. Not that we have that much to control. The stuff in the outer system will take longer to get back, and I'm not sure if we should be bringing them in-system unless we have a plan. Oliver cut in. Guys, I calculate that we have at most 3 hours before Medeiros gets to the nearest Lagrange factory. Can we deal with the printers first? There was silence all around, and I nodded. Okay, separate the printers from the printhead. Send each item off in a separate trajectory to eventually end up at one or the other colony. No beacons. We'll have to find them by dead reckoning, so make sure you have the orbital parameters carefully recorded. I looked around at all the other Bobs. Do we have anything explosive? I got several head shakes by way of response. We don't like explodey stuff, Oliver said. Yeah, and look where that's gotten us. Will waved a hand to get us back on track. Is there anything else we can do? I thought for a moment. We'll have to advise the colonies. We can also get an inventory from them of anything they have in the way of automation. They may have explosives, maybe even some small printers. Someone needs to go over Mac's blog with a fine-tooth comb, looking for anything at all that might be useful. Let's get started on all of that, then we'll regroup and see what we've come up with. There were nods, and Bob started popping out to work on their assigned tasks. I sat back and rubbed my forehead. Like the others weren't enough of a headache. Outstanding. 22. Derelict. Herschel. March 22-27. Kuiper Belt, Delta Pavonis. Neil and I moved slowly between the drifting hulks, surge drives on lowest power. The 2 others' cargo vessels loomed huge around us, 10 kilometers in length and a kilometer in diameter. They felt more like planetoids than something constructed by intelligent beings. They even came with their own debris field. The derelicts had taken some pretty severe hits from the looks of it. Pieces of cargo vessel drifted lazily in complicated orbits around the 2 ships. The effect was eerie, like floating through an underwater graveyard. I messaged Neil. I'm not picking up anything. You? Nope. Temps are down around thermal equilibrium. These things haven't done anything but drift in a long time. Oh? We were targeting essential systems. I think the attacks will have taken out power cores, and you know how that always ends up. Yeah, kablooey. We separated and completed individual circumnavigations of the wrecks. No surprises. By unspoken agreement, we deployed drones carrying squads of roamers. The drones had orders to do close-up scans, while the roamers would offload and poke around anything interesting. Finding a way in wasn't really a problem. One of the hulks had been almost cut in 2. The 2 halves were more disconnected than connected. Only in freefall could such a small ribbon of metal hold together such massive segments. The second hulk was in much better shape, a hole literally big enough to drive a battleship into, on a ship this size, barely qualified as a ding. But it's not the size of the damage, it's the quality. We must have taken out something critical. The ships had been drifting for 10 years now. We didn't really expect any kind of activity, but we'd learned caution from previous encounters with the others, and from a generation of B-movies. The opportunity to examine the interior of an others cargo vessel was too tempting to pass up, of course. We spent several hours real-time planning for every contingency we could think of. Then, leaving a couple of drones on lookout, we cautiously entered the cargo vessel through the rent in its side. Right away, things got complicated. The ship wasn't, it turned out, just a big cavern. We found ourselves in a large bay or hold or something, forming a pie-shaped section of the interior. That might have been the end of the exploration, except that whatever had taken out the cargo vessel had apparently continued right through the ship, taking out a lot of equipment in the process. At the other end of the cavernous space, we exited into what appeared to be a central corridor, about 100 meters in diameter. It extended from one end of the ship to the other. This certainly explained the large armored doors at either end of the cargo vessels. "This thing is mostly intact," Neil said in a near whisper. "You don't think it could still activate, do you?" "You saw the equipment back there, Neil." I noticed I was whispering as well, but couldn't help it. This had the feel of exploring a haunted castle. Not sure what we took out exactly, but it must have been critical. "Can I have that in writing?" "Sure, no problem. Bend over, and I'll get my felt pen." "Oh, ha-ha. If we get eaten by ants, you'll look pretty stupid." "Well, that's why we agreed not to do any Sudar sweeps. You were listening, right?" Neil snorted, but didn't respond directly. "I'll head that way, toward the end with the reinforced ring." "No problem. Be careful." We drifted off in opposite directions, doing a visual-only inspection. It took less than a day to reach the ends of the ship. I received a call from Neil. "Hey, Herschel? I'm looking at this huge thingamajig, and I think it's the power core." "Wait, you mean in one piece? And what are you doing in one of the bays?" "It was open. I went in. Sue me." I sighed. I'd have done the same. "So what did the attack take out, if that's the power core?" "Maybe a fluke shot through the AI or something, but this is definitely the power core. The size of the conduits kind of gives it away." "Fusion reaction shut down gracefully?" There was a moment of silence. "Well, that's the thing. I don't think this is a fusion reactor." Suddenly, this was more than just a scavenging mission. "Have you found any indications of ants?" Neil responded in the negative. I took a moment to double-check my train of thought, then said, "Okay, we can't put that off anymore. We have to know if we're going to have a problem. So let's move all our equipment out of the hulks. We'll do a low-power Sudar sweep to see if we activate any ants. Once we're sure it's clean, let's take a couple of high-resolution scans of this mystery equipment and see if we can figure it out." Affirmative. Telltales showed Neil's devices vacating the hulks. I ordered mine out as well. Within an hour, we had our scans, but no answers. Not really. Neil popped over so we could review the results. I gestured at a hologram that slowly rotated in the air. "Well, you're right. It's not fusion-based, but it's definitely the power generation facility." I looked at Neil and grinned. "We may have just found some new tech." "Cool," Neil replied. "We should call Bill, I guess." "Are you kidding me? Just hand it over and let someone else get all the glory? No friggin' way!" "Aw, geez, Hirsch. I'm getting that bad idea." "Again? You're usually..." "Me? Since when?" Bother to reply. The traditional exchange, as always, made us both feel better. But Neil wasn't necessarily wrong. I hoped I hadn't just taken the first steps toward kissing my ass goodbye. 23. Death. Howard. May 2220, Omicron Squared, Aridony. It was the call I'd been dreading for decades. Dr. Onagi looked out the video window at me. I could see from the background that he was calling from the hospital. There was no warning, Howard. She simply collapsed. We got her admitted, but our efforts were... it back ruthlessly. I appreciate the call, Dr. Onagi, but I'm a little perplexed that it's you calling me. Shouldn't her children be doing this? Well, Howie maybe. I doubted Rosie would be dialing me up. Dr. Onagi looked to the side for a moment. Well, they very likely would have by now, but per Mrs. Brodeur's instructions, we placed her body in stasis immediately, post-mortem. Her children were livid and are seeking legal counsel as far as I know. I got the impression that you figure prominently in that. They may not be talking to you at all. I stared, stunned. Bridget hadn't given me any indication that she'd changed her mind. I thanked Dr. Onagi for the information and ended the call. I immediately phoned Ms. Benning. Good afternoon, Mr. Johansson. I've just heard about Mrs. Brodeur. I'm so sorry for your loss. She's been placed in stasis. Dr. Onagi says that was per her instructions. Has something happened? She changed her will a few months ago. Normally, I wouldn't be able to discuss this with you, but she specifically instructed me to read you in. Ms. Benning reached off screen for a moment. And according to E-Bar, her children have just filed an injunction to force the hospital to remove her body from stasis. This is not unexpected, and we already have countervailing filings in place. There will be a hearing, for which you should make yourself available. I'll keep you informed. We exchanged a few more bits of information, then she disconnected. I sat back in my beach chair, staring into space. Bridget was dead. I should be a useless puddle on the floor. I had no doubt that I would be soon, but the unexpected news about her turnaround on the replication issue had thrown me for a loop. Well, I could make myself useful while I was still in one piece. I built scanning equipment from the information Riker and I had gleaned. Time for an inspection. The hearing was relatively informal, held in the judge's office rather than the courtroom. Howie, Rosie, and Leanne sat to one side of the room, and Ms. Benning and I at the other. Dr. Onagi, representing the hospital, sat in a more neutral, central position. Judge Ulrich Katz silently scanned the documents in front of him for a few more moments, then looked up.
Issues with the last wishes of decedents are always difficult. When surviving loved ones...
He's not a loved one, Rosie interjected. The judge stared at her silently, and Leanne put a hand on her arm. Order being restored, the judge continued.
When surviving loved ones disagree about the specifics, but this court cannot make assumptions about the decision in advance of the actual trial. Decanting the decedent at this time will effectively give the decision to the plaintiffs, regardless of the outcome. Whereas if the decedent is left in stasis, she can still be decanted should the decision go that way. And conversely, allowing scanning before a decision is rendered cannot be reversed. Therefore, I will not grant the injunction to have the body decanted immediately. Dr. Onagi, you will maintain the body in its current state, and you will not allow any other operations to be performed on it until otherwise ordered by this court. The judge didn't bang a gavel. I'd been half expecting it. Of course, my experience with court was 100 years out of date, from the wrong continent, on a different planet, and came mostly from TV anyway. I stood up and looked over at Bridget's children. The girls were rigid with the effort of not looking my way. Bridget's son, Howie, glanced at me and shook his head minutely. I took the hint. We let them exit first, then followed. I looked at Ms. Benning and raised an eyebrow. She opened her mouth to answer, did a small double take, and smiled. Mr. Johansson, I've known intellectually for some time that you were walking around in an artificial body. After all, it's not only germane to this case, but has also been the subject of much gossip. Especially the nature of your relationship with Mrs. Brodeur.
Miss Benning blushed slightly. But I've just now consciously realized that I'm not talking to a live, biological human being. I'm impressed at the verisimilitude. I smiled sadly. Thank you, Miss Benning. We Bobs have been putting a lot of effort into getting the androids as believable as possible. And to answer the not quite unspoken question, there's no sexual component to my relationship with Mrs. Broger. I could have engineered the capability, but I didn't. I am deeply in love with her, and she loves, or loved, me in a much less intense but still very real way. Miss Benning nodded. I have no doubt of your essential humanity, Mr. Johansson. I dealt with you over the transfer of title for the business. Remember? Your emotional turmoil was obvious and very real. We walked in silence for a few moments before she continued. While it will be an uphill battle for the plaintiffs, it's not a slam dunk by any means for us. But Mrs. Broger expected pushback from her children and made some arrangements in advance, including setting up a defense fund that the children wouldn't be able to block. I nodded silently. Bridget had always been a careful, methodical thinker. Went with the career choice, I guess. She'd have covered all the bases. None of which made things any easier. I had Bridget's permission to replicate her, but I would have to wait for the wheels of justice to slowly grind their way to a conclusion. 24. Explorations. Herschel, April 22-27, Kuiper Belt, Delta Pavonis. Ants must feel like this. The other's carrier, which we'd named Hulk 1, was massive. A 10-kilometer-long cylinder, 1 kilometer in diameter. It dwarfed even our version 5 Heaven hulls. At the moment, I was slowly drifting down the central access shaft while roamers painted numbers on each cargo door. I wasn't just being anal. We discovered that we needed to refer to specific locations by something more helpful than grunting and pointing. Sadar scans had revealed a lot of details about the ship and its contents, but sooner or later, we would have to try powering it up. Those massive cargo segment doors wouldn't be opening manually, never mind the 100-meter diameter hatches at each end. How's it going, Herschel? Fine, I replied. Almost done. 864 cargo bays. That number mean anything to you? There was a moment of silence before Neil replied. It's 600, base 12. And come to think of it, the other's image that Bill retrieved had 6 feeding fingers on each side of its maw. I grinned. Coincidence? I think not. Nope, there's another universal, I think. Your number base will depend on your number of digits. The PAV were base 10. Our base 10, Neil. They're not all gone. There was a sigh. Yeah. Well, there was a mood killer. Anyway, I said, perhaps too brightly, as soon as I'm done here, we can get on to the job of figuring out the power system. I'm anxious to see what some of the stuff in those bays actually is. As long as we don't activate some of the stuff in the process. Yeah, I hear you. Maybe we'll have a nuke in place just in case we need to terminate with prejudice. I have a concern about that, Herschel. I'd rather avoid any action that results in destroying Hulk 1. Well, hold on. I took a moment to load my roamers and the attendant drones and admire the last numbered bay.
Und was treibt mein
864.
Leutnant?
I don't see how we can do this without some
Was hat
risk,
denn
buddy.
halt vor?
How about we cut into one of the bays? Well, that was certainly an option. The bay partitions were stupid thick, but we weren't on a schedule. Okay, let's do that. We cut into bay number 1, simply because Sadar scans showed a lot of unidentifiable stuff in it. The roamers had to cut trenches in the wall and keep widening them, but eventually they were able to pull a plug of metal away from the surrounding wall. We left it floating in the central corridor and sent in a half-dozen roamers. It looked like this carrier hadn't disgorged all its fighting units before we'd taken it out. The bay contained several dozen drones, each slightly bigger than a Heaven 1 vessel. They were in cradles with umbilicals connecting them to the ship, probably control and power feeds. Of course, there was no power, and we'd taken out the ship AI, so no control. Neil poked a finger at a close-up image of an umbilical connection. If we unhook that, do you think the drone will come to life? Don't know, Neil. I rubbed my forehead. A delaying tactic, and we both knew it. Ultimately, do we really have an alternative? Neil stared at the video window for a full 2 seconds before turning to me. Okay, how about this? Take one apart, piece by piece. Analyze as we go. Eventually, we should be able to figure out what their readiness state is. That is the least bad idea I've ever heard. I grinned back at him. Let's do it. It took more than a week to strip the drone down, piece by piece. In the end, we were forced to conclude that activation was probably done from the carrier AI's end, not at the drone's end. In any case, the one we'd disassembled had been inert, no power, and no way to power up without power. Just the same, paranoia was the watchword. We picked a random drone and placed roamers inside it, ready to begin breaking things if the drone got uppity. Ready? I said to Neil. Ready, he replied. Neil was in charge of destruction, and I was in charge of unplugging. Without giving myself any more opportunity for second guessing, I instructed the roamer to eject the umbilical from the drone. We waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Enough of this, Neil grumbled. It's scanning time. Matching actions to words, he instructed one of our drones to give the subject a good once-over. The scan came up in my holotank within milliseconds. Nothing. Inert. I looked at Neil. Satisfied? Me? Since when am I the bad guy? Since always. I'm always reassuring you. Oh, bite me. You are so full of it. Neil shook his head in sorrow. So next question, do we cut into every cargo bay with something in it and start unhooking stuff? That'll take years. What's our alternative? I'm starting to like the nuke idea. Neil gave me a crooked grin. Okay, I replied. We're going to have to trace all the wiring to find out if we can leave the bays unpowered if we start up the reactor. And, sorry to say, we're also going to have to place a nuke in here in case we wake something up that we shouldn't have. Let's just hope it doesn't come to that. Neil sighed. This is beginning to sound too much like real work. Real work described it very well. Some of the others' design decisions were, well, suboptimal. At least as far as we could tell. In several cases, power conduits split, went around a large patch of nothing in particular, then reconnected on the far side. We scanned the section of nothing twice, but found, nothing. Well, look, Neil mused. Sometimes when you're designing something, you make allowances for future expansion. As long as you have a good idea what the requirements will be, you can allow for it. So it's an expansion slot. Yeah, thanks, Captain Sarcasm. Still, you're probably not far wrong. That's wonderful, Neil. But are we any closer to being able to activate this flying island nation? Let's have a look, Hirsch. With that, Neil pulled up our working schematic. He quickly updated it with this latest information, then directed the simulation to power up. We watched the simulation as telltales indicated virtual sections that were receiving power. Eventually, the simulation ended with the Hulk in a stable state, and no issues that we could see. Neil and I looked at each other, smiled, and said in unison, "We're good to go." 25. Battle. Bill, June 22-23, 82 Aridity. Premier Campbell put her face in her hands and was silent for several seconds. President Ito attempted to remain stoic, but I could see that he was shaking. Campbell looked up. Matt? He's gone? No, ma'am, I replied. We have his matrix. Or at least it's still in one piece and we know where it is, but he's offline for the moment. We're trying to get it to a colony site for safekeeping. Campbell nodded, looking relieved. And how can we help, Mr. Johansson? I turned to President Ito's video image. We're trying to inventory all our assets in this system. Anything that can be used as a weapon, anything that can be remote controlled, anything SCUT-enabled, anything that can get out of atmosphere. How do the androids work? I believe there's one at each colony site. I brightened. Those are SCUT-controlled, so yes, we can use those. That's one more, well, 2 more control loci for us. As soon as we can, we'll send a couple of drones to pick them up. We can use them to relay orders to the non-Scut mining drones. I thought for a moment. Plus, they'll be useful to supplement the roamers for manipulation. Ito nodded, and silence descended. Campbell finally broke the pause.
We are at war, essentially, right? Are the colonies in danger?
I considered for a millisecond. I don't see how. At least on an immediate basis, ma'am. Medeiros doesn't have anything that can bomb you from orbit. If we can keep the auto factories from him, or at least keep the printers away, that won't change. If he gets a printer, or already has one, he still has to bootstrap up through all the automation needed for an auto factory before he can start building something like an asteroid mover. And there's no way he'll be dumb enough to try to print anything explosive. On the other hand, Ito said in a slow drawl, inviting me to explain counterpoint. I grinned. On the other hand, we have no printer capability at the moment. Although we are in possession of the actual printers, more or less. And we'd have to go through the same bootstrapping process. To a lesser extent, maybe because we have roamers and drones, and now the 2 androids.
So it's détente.
I'm not sure it's even at that level, ma'am. That Hugh Grant and Colin Firth fight scene in Bridget Jones's Diary. Asking. Apparently, Mac already had a reputation. Look, I continued. If we can get one or more of the printers onto one of your worlds and get enough raw elements down for it, and do all this without being intercepted by Medeiros, then we can maybe build busters or something.
That's a lot of ifs,
Campbell replied. Well, it'll depend on what Medeiros does next. I'm afraid we're forced to react to his moves. Any attempt on our part to control the play will result in a missile down our throats.
How many missiles does he have?
0, we thought, so unknown. Ito thought for a moment.
You have a number of mining drones, I understand. Can you use them to ram the Brazilian?
It was a good try, and I nodded an acknowledgement. Sorry, President Ito, but that would be like trying to ram a sports car with tractors. In principle, you could do damage, but first you have to catch him. Ito sighed and sat back. Again, there was a contemplative silence. Look, I said, if you think of anything, call, email, or text me. We'll keep working on it from our end, and I'll keep you updated.
Good enough.
Premier Campbell nodded and ended her connection. A moment later, Ito blinked out as well. I sighed, sat back, and looked at the ceiling, like the others weren't bad enough. By the time Medeiros got to the nearest LaGrange Auto Factory location, we'd long since flung the printers and print heads well beyond his ability to detect them. The Bobs had also managed to hide, damage, or collect most of the Auto Factory automation, leaving nothing valuable except the actual metal ingots. We watched Medeiros from a non-Scut drone, carefully disguised as Flotsam, running on power cells so as not to show up on radiation detectors. It would run down soon, but if Medeiros didn't pick up on it, a regular mining drone, and one without a fusion reactor. The Brazilian craft buzzed around, inspecting and searching, then settled on a single location and stopped moving. I half expected some kind of raid destroying things, but realistically, Medeiros was career military and presumably well-disciplined. He wouldn't waste missiles on petulance. I hoped he would decide on a strategy before the drone gave out. We'd identified 3 possibilities. 1, head for one of the colonies and set up a picket, on the presumption that we had sent at least one printer that way. 2, head off and start scanning for printers and print heads on their lonely trajectories. Or 3, start looking for roamers and mining drones to either destroy or try to take over. And finally, just when the drone was on its last few watts of stored power, Medeiros accelerated out of the area. Do we have an indication of where he's going? I jerked in surprise. Too intent on watching Medeiros, I hadn't realized that Will was visiting my VR. I turned to him. I don't think so. He's just headed off in what appears to be some random direction. The power cells are about to give out, so we can't track him by SUDAR. Will muttered an expletive, a clear indication that the situation was getting to him. We have to assume scenarios 1 or 2 then, since they're the worst cases. How many printers and heads have we rerouted to a colony? 2 of each going to each colony, well spread out. Of course, he can spot them on approach with a SUDAR sweep, but he'll have to be close enough to physically intercept. Then he'll have to intercept without destroying them. Destruction is acceptable from our point of view. I nodded. This is going to be a long, drawn-out battle, Will. Garfield and I were sitting, drinking coffee, taking one of our increasingly rare breaks, when Guppy popped in.
Printer convoy en route to Asgard has been hit with a SUDAR sweep.
Garfield and I looked at each other. Crap, he said. That means he went for option 1. I guess it makes sense, I replied. For option 2, he'd be scanning an increasingly large volume of space. This way, we are essentially coming to him. I turned to Guppy. Were you able to triangulate?
Negative. Sweep was short range.
Smart, Garfield said. He doesn't announce himself unless he makes contact, and if he does, he's right on top of us. Which means he's right on top of us. I smacked my forehead. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I checked, and this particular group has no SCUT. They'll have to operate on standing orders.
Convoy has been disabled. Video feed cut off.
Garfield and I exchanged a look. Had Medeiros simply blown up the convoy? Was his plan to deny us the printers? Wordlessly, I called up the truncated video. Garfield watched the 3-second sequence. Well, hell, I said when we were done. It appears Medeiros can learn. He's building busters. Or he built busters. Wait, when did he build busters? Garfield frowned and continued. If this is the Alpha Centauri Medeiros, then his first exposure to us was the day we raised their installation. He would have had to build busters after that. There was no indication that the Brazilians were building kinetic weapons before that point. I gave him a sickly grin. Sorry, buddy, I guess you missed the conversation after the attack. We figure he has at least one printer of his own. So he learned from Alpha Centauri. So why is he doing what he's doing? Two-pronged strategy. Attempt to gather as many printers as he can while denying them to us. Geometric progression means a small advantage up front can turn into an insurmountable lead, eventually. I stared into space for a few milliseconds. We have to take him out, now. If he gets ahead of us, the colonists are as good as dead. Garfield closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. And we put them there. Captain Richards from the Asgard colony pressed his lips together and said nothing. He didn't have to. On top of everything the colonists were dealing with, they now had Medeiros to worry about. Are you certain that he will attack the colony? Not certain, Captain, but he's made it pretty clear on previous encounters that he is utterly loyal to Brazil, considers us to be at war, and isn't interested in discussions. I'm also not entirely sure he's sane at this point. I looked over at Garfield, who rolled his eyes dramatically. I'd hate to try communicating with him, only to find that we'd attracted his attention to the colonies. Richards nodded and sat back with a huff. And we have nothing. Not that we've been able to find. We could ask Mac if we could get him onto a cradle, but right now we can't risk trying to fly his matrix in. We're getting occasional glimpses of Medeiros, and he does his best to destroy anything he detects. At both colonies? How many of him are there? Richards frowned at me. I thought for a second. There's no overlap in appearances, so there's only one of him, but I think he's programmed his busters to patrol and knock down anything they detect. Right now, he owns the high ground. General Kiroshi from the Japanese colony had been listening without comment in another video. Now he spoke up. We have only small printers. Useful for quick manufacturing of minor items, but insufficient for anything like your busters. And it would take months to bootstrap up to real industrial printers. Richards nodded. Same here. Ours are big enough to print more mosquito killers, but that's... Wait, what? I sat up straight. Richards raised an eyebrow. Super vampire something mosquitoes. Mac didn't mention them? Yes, I remember them. I gave him a sideways glare. I didn't realize you were handling manufacturing yourselves.
Well, sure. Because we needed thousands and Mac couldn't be bothered. They're about the size of a baseball, so not really useful for anything but mosquito patrol.
But thousands? I leaned forward, radiating interest. Richards' eyes started to grow rounder as he realized something was up.
Yes, most of them are on standby right now, since we seem to have beaten back the Scourge. We were going to return them to raw materials eventually, but I think we had 3,000 or 4,000 running around at one point.
I let a slow smile grow on my face. They may be small, but a few hundred hitting a buster at the same time will still have an effect. We may be able to clear the sky around Asgard long enough to get the printers to ground.
Can they even fly outside of atmosphere?
Not a problem, Captain. It's actually more trouble building them to fly in atmosphere.
Excellent,
the captain said.
Let's get this operation going.
The mosquito killers were too small to carry Scud comms, so we had to give the AMIs complete enough instructions to handle any situation we could think of. 1 in each 100 was designated as an observer, ordered to send a video record back to the colony, if possible, or to record and return otherwise. We sent off 2,000 killers in 5 squads, hoping to catch as many busters as possible by surprise. A couple of killers were programmed to leak radio telemetry, which hopefully would attract some of Medeiros' devices. Captain Richards was mirroring everything to Kiroshi and myself. I watched the numerous video windows as the observers delivered status and telemetry.
Got a blip,
Captain Richards announced. I'd seen the change in the video window several milliseconds before, of course, but there was no good reason to remind him of my true nature. The telemetry from the observer indicated 2 bogies approaching the group. Per their orders, the killers changed course to intercept. We hoped that Medeiros hadn't programmed caution into his busters. A bunch of baseball-sized objects hopefully wouldn't trigger the default danger avoidance routine. The busters zeroed in on the noisy killers, seemingly ignoring the cloud of attendants. At the last possible moment, every single mosquito killer altered course to aim directly at the 2 busters. The change apparently registered with the dim AMI brains because both busters went into hard turns. Too little, too late, though. The smaller and more maneuverable killers easily kept up with the change in vectors. Contact wasn't the dramatic flash we were used to seeing as 2 heavy devices collided at interplanetary speeds. The killers avoided the large steel ball up front and went for reactor cooling radiators, surge emitters, and other obvious signs of technology. It was like being pelted in a hailstorm. The first couple dozen impacts had no real effect, then dents started to appear, followed by seams popping, then parts flying off. In less than 30 seconds, the busters were drifting aimlessly, and we still had more than 100 killers left.
See if you can get them to shepherd the parts into low orbit, Richard suggested. If we can rescue the material, great. Otherwise, we push it into atmosphere and deny it to Medeiros.
I nodded. A good strategy. I wasn't sure how we'd get that much mass down to ground level, other than the obvious way, but I'd worry about that once we'd rescued some drones.
Cool down.
Richards grinned at me, then turned in his video window to face Kiroshi.
General, once we've cleared the Asgard environs, I'll send a squad of mosquito killers your way.
General Kiroshi nodded.
Thank you. Even if we are not ultimately successful, the process of attrition should keep Medeiros busy.
Yes, I added. We just need to knock off busters faster than he can make them. And if he's making busters, he's not making more printers.
We'll keep at this, Bill.
Captain Richards nodded to me.
I'll keep you up to date.
Good enough. I still had a war with the others to prepare for. 26. Cities in fight. Marcus, September 2215, Poseidon. I watched the long-range image which showed the expanding cloud of debris that used to be my heaven vessel decoy. I'd been lying about my location for several months now, and the Council seemed to have bought it. 3 Council security vessels left the area at far too high an acceleration for the cargo vessels they appeared to be. It seemed the Council could be sneaky as well. I fired off a report to Riker, CC'd to Bill, and saved a backup to my Fortress of Solitude, circling Eta Cassiopeia B. If the Council ever found that,
Эй, земляк, мы тебя не... Понятно. Давай, мочи их! Вон он, сука!
that, I'd be thoroughly hooped. Fortunately, that was unlikely. The Council still had fewer than a dozen ships, and the companion star simply hadn't come up in discussions for a long time. Of course, the Council had obviously been engaging in covert preparations as well, as evinced by the 3 souped-up and armed cargo ships. Now that they believed me dead, I hoped that they would openly play their hand at parade rest. As I moved my arms into a more relaxed position, everyone turned to me.
Well?
Cal said. I grinned at him. 3 very non-standard cargo vessels just took out my decoy vessel. It would have attempted evasive tactics consistent with its published specs. I'm sure the security personnel are very proud of themselves.
What about the cargo vessels?
I've got some stealth busters following them right now, but we don't know where strength is or where they've placed it. I have to assume that my estimate of a dozen ships is incorrect. We'll have to take a wait-and-see stance until they show their hand. And remember, officially, I'm dead. Gina looked up from her phone and cut into the conversation.
They've moved on 4 cities. Lothar, Morbus, Xanator, and Gethal. Attempted to board and take over. You were right. They were trying to avoid damaging the cities.
Status? I asked.
Repelled with significant losses. They didn't expect resistance. They also didn't expect,
Gina replied.
weapon systems that weren't on the blueprints.
I grinned. My fault. I forgot to file the changes with the permits department. Cal waved his phone.
They've made an announcement.
We all turned to him, eager to hear what the Council had come up with. Cal read through the text, deliberately injecting a pompous tone into the pronouncement. When he was done, we all sat in a semicircle, ready for a council of war. So the takeaway, I said, looking up at the dome overhead, is that the evil replicant is defunct and everyone should be good little citizens and come back to the mats. Or else.
And if we don't, they'll start shooting down cities in 24 hours.
Cal shook his head in exaggerated disbelief.
We're at war now, even if the word hasn't actually been used. Blowing Marcus up can't really be misinterpreted.
I suppose they could take the stance that I'm not alive, therefore it was just a case of obsoleting some recalcitrant equipment. I gave my friends a lopsided grin. And the thing with those cities could be called a police action. Gina rolled her eyes at me, mocking my favorite expression.
Or they were just tired of listening to you talk. Now are you willing to start fighting?
I shook my head. I still don't know where all their assets are. I want to take everything out cleanly in one strike. And I don't want to have to kill anyone.
Good luck with that.
Cal muttered. We spent the next few hours monitoring developments. Things seemed to have settled into a stalemate, with the Council making threats and the cities daring them to try or simply remaining silent. Then, more trouble. 2 ships came out of Sunward and launched missiles at Amber. My assets were all space-side, shadowing or searching for Council assets, so I had nothing for defense. The city, though, had those undocumented features. Particle weapon turrets, courtesy of Bill's Skunk Works, activated immediately and attempted to shoot the missiles out of the sky. The attackers responded by firing more missiles. I'm impressed, I said. The basic cargo ship design doesn't have a lot of room for weapons storage and launchers. I'd be interested in seeing how...
Christ's sake, Marcus, we're in danger here. Could you dial it back?
I gave Cal a rueful smile by way of apology, then turned back to watch the drama. The ships seemed to have emptied themselves of missiles, and our defensive batteries had taken out the first 2 missiles. The second pair were getting too close for comfort, though, and seemed to have figured out the defensive patterns, as they were evading all attempts to shoot them out of the sky. With a flash, I took control of a couple of flyers sitting in the docking bay. I sent them toward the missiles at full acceleration. Flyers were not military vehicles or flying explosives, so they really had no chance of catching or even intercepting an approaching missile. But they did have the effect of splitting the attention of the missile AMIs. It was just enough to slow down the dodging, and the defensive turrets blew both missiles out of the air. The ships, now apparently unarmed, turned and flew off. I called a couple of drones from orbit to shadow them. If they flew back to a base somewhere to reload, I'd have a target. But there was no time to celebrate our victory. Cal leaped to his feet and uttered a string of profanities. Then he turned to look at the rest of us and said, "The bastard shot down Thark." There were gasps and cries of shock, but not surprise. Thark and Amhor were the residences of what we somewhat ironically called the Revolutionary Council. We'd published disinformation, but somehow the Council had seen through it. Regardless, the Council had just upped the ante. Gina asked,
Survivors?
Cal looked at his phone for several seconds, his eyes moving back and forth. I noticed that several other people were poking their tablets furiously.
Their escape pods were observed ejecting before it hit water, but I'd bet not everyone got out.
Gina glared at me.
Now we're at war. They're trying to hit us everywhere at once, to end it before we can react. It's not going to stop until they think they've won. It will just continue to escalate. More and more people will die. Now, Marcus.
I sighed and nodded my head. Without a word, I deactivated my Android and returned to VR. A quick status check at computer speeds showed that I had busters on all council. I ordered all busters to attack, concentrating on taking out the reactor or drive systems. The subject of cloaking technology hadn't really come up in conversation with the council, so the ships were caught flat-footed. All clean shots. There should be no deaths unless someone was standing right by the reactor at the wrong time. Escape pods ejected. None of which would help with the Council. For that, I activated Phase 2. The Council had set up security at strategic locations such as power stations and flyer depots, as well as roving patrols to ensure citizens stayed put and obeyed curfews. I gave the command and cargo drones dropped off squads of roamers throughout the northern and southern maps. I'd learned the utility of roamers as foot soldiers almost 100 years ago in New Handletown. This time, I had more than just the 20-centimeter models available. All over the towns and industrial sections, Council security forces found themselves set upon by roamers. From the 1-inch models that would try to crawl down your pants, right up to the 2-meter heavy lifting models. Every single one armed with plasma cutters, pliers, and a total lack of fear. Within 10 minutes, I got the all-clear from Gina, who was coordinating with local resistance. I pulled up a video window. Have you located the Council members yet? Gina shook her head.
No. As we expected, their published locations were all bogus. Chances are their movement history is at least partly fiction as well. We're analyzing on the basis of defensibility and obscurity.
I nodded. My money is still on subs. Gina snorted.
If so, they can stay out there all they want. I'm not going to risk an encounter with a Kraken or Hydra just to capture those turds.
Maybe the wildlife will take care of it for us. Cal popped up in another call window, joining the conference. We've got control of the comms center. Want me to send out on all points?
Do it.
I nodded. And see if you can get an update on Thark. Already done. We've pulled about half the population out of the drink. Cal responded. Still scanning for more pods. At the moment, there are about 150 people missing. I closed my eyes, feeling nauseated. We'd admitted the possibility of casualties, but the reality, even a potential reality at the moment, was so much harder to take. Okay, Cal. Keep me updated. When I had time, I would have to do some soul searching.
Salute!
The Silent Revolution, the Soul System War, and the overthrow of New Jerusalem, my various incarnations seemed to always be in the thick of things. How many deaths was I answerable for? 27. Repairs. Herschel, July 22-27, Delta Pavonis. There's no real reason for your virtual reality self to be tense. I knew that. It didn't help. I found myself gritting my teeth so hard that my jaw began to ache. After months of investigation and tinkering, Neil and I were ready to try activating the power core. We had the nuclear deterrent sitting in the middle of the central corridor, just in case. But truthfully, neither of us really thought it would be necessary. The wiring had eventually succumbed to our detective work, and we were confident that we would be able to power up the core without powering up the bays. Which still left the question of activating the power core. Since we'd never seen this particular technology before, there was a lot of guesswork involved. Needless to say, guesswork and power cores did not go well together. We weren't total idiots. We were standing on more than 1,000 clicks, while the roamers and drones ran through the final steps. I idly wondered, for a moment, if the AMIs ever got tired of wearing the red shirts. Probably not, or they'd have gone on strike by now. If this doesn't work, we're going to be in deep doo-doo. Neil glanced sideways at me. Better than being a cloud of ionized gas. And even if it does work, there are going to be questions, Neil. We really should have announced the find on the first day. Neil glared at me, one side of his mouth up in a sneer of disbelief. I hate you. I grinned at him. Okay, joking aside, buddy. We're 8th generation mobs. Pond scum. Star Trek security looks down their noses at us. I'd like to have something under my belt that I can stamp on my hull. Neil took a deep breath, let it out slowly. Yeah, if everything goes well, all will be forgiven. So, scanning started. Neil responded, taking the hint. We have an image. Okay, Herschel. Anytime. I gave the order, and the roamers started the activation procedure in Hulk 1. It took almost 3 minutes for the alien equipment to go through whatever startup sequence it needed. We could review the whole thing later via the recorded SUDAR video. And finally, pay dirt. Lights came on in the alien craft. Readings indicated rising power levels in engineering subsystems. We'd been careful to ensure that most of the vessel remained unpowered. We certainly didn't want to activate a security system somewhere. The roamers ran a few output tests and reported the results. I whistled. That's just a stupid level of power generation, assuming it's linear. Remember that scene in Forbidden Planet with the power meters? Neil grinned at me. This is just like that. We're barely tilting the first meter. I nodded, eyes unfocused. I think it might be time to pay Bill a visit. Well, there are no laws in the Bobaverse, of course. Bill's expression belied the casualness of his tone. Neil and I looked at each other nervously. But you guys are still morons. Bill raised his hands in an I give up gesture. If something had gone wrong and taken you out, we'd never have known about it. We've been doing backups, Bill. And how would we know to activate your backup? ESP? Oh, yeah, there's that. I looked down at my shoes. Bill relented a little, seeing my expression. Actually, Herschel, that's another project I'm working on. The Battle of Delta Pavonis made it clear that we need a more organized backup system. He waved us toward chairs and called in Jeeves. It looked like we wouldn't be flayed after all. Okay, fill me in. I sat down and accepted a coffee. It took a moment to give me time to calm my nerves. Then I called up the diagram and schematics of the record. Found the hulks, got the power system working in one of them. The power core is not fusion-based. I'd almost swear it uses some variation on the Casimir effect. There's a separate analysis on that. I pushed one set of schematics aside to bring up a larger scale diagram. Hulk 2 is scrapped. We've been through it from one end to the other, and there's nothing interesting. It's basically a big old pile of salvage. We've had our devices breaking it down into transportable chunks for a couple of months now. But here's the thing. I paused for effect. Hulk 1 is a big, sort of hollow container with built-in power. The AI and drive systems are gone, of course, but so what? I grinned at Bill. Bill frowned, and I realized he hadn't gotten it. I looked at Neil, suddenly uncertain. Had we missed something obvious? Were we about to paint ourselves as total twits? Neil rolled his eyes, just the tiniest amount, then turned to Bill. Put a set of mover plates around it, Bill, and it's the biggest damn colony ship ever made. It just needs stasis pods. Bill's eyes slowly grew wide as the penny dropped. Holy... I grinned, confidence returning. And you could move the entire remaining Earth population in one trip.
What on?
Payback. April 22-24, Eden. Caerleon was a busy area, almost frantic. Maybe it was the age of the residents and the relative lack of family groups. Caerleon had been colonized by juveniles just into puberty and going through the adolescent rebellion stage. Marvin and I agreed that we'd created a baby boomer generation when we moved everyone to Camelot and the birth rate subsequently surged. All those teenagers, getting hormonal at the same time, had probably just egged each other on. At any rate, it made sneaking up a difficult operation. I had the advantages of lack of scent and ability to stay completely still, of course. Plus some commando camouflage tricks that I looked up in the ship libraries. Still, it took almost 5 hours to maneuver into position. Original Bob would have been a single giant muscle cramp by that point, but the android muscles didn't get tired. And I was now in position. Surveillance had shown that Fred had a preferred location for his bodily functions, and he was very much a creature of habit. I picked a spot where I could take him on the way back and settled down to wait. As Fred turned back to the trail, I slammed into it, shoving him up against a tree. I placed the edge of my flint knife against his throat. Hello, Fred. Remember our last conversation? Fred's eyes were wide with fear, and he made no attempt to struggle. I own you right now, Cootsie. I practically spit his favorite insult back in his face. Whether you live to see the sun set today depends on my mood. Understand?
Ist das die große?
Na, der ist glorreich verkümmert. Na, der ist glorreich verkümmert.